The morning was peaceful, the kind of calm that made suburban life feel like an escape from the chaos of the world. Birds chirped, the distant hum of a lawnmower filled the air, and neighbors were just beginning to emerge from their homes with coffee in hand, ready to start their day. But then bang! A deafening crash shattered the serenity, sending shockwaves through the entire neighborhood. Windows rattled, car alarms blared, and a collective gasp rippled down the street as people rushed outside to see what had just happened. There, in the middle of an otherwise quiet cul-de-sac, lay a mangled wreckage, smoke curling into the sky like the ghost of a battle just fought. It didn't take long before panicked murmurs turned into frantic questioning. What was that? Was it an accident? Did someone crash? But before anyone could fully comprehend the situation, a high-pitched, authoritative voice sliced through the confusion like a blade. "I did what needed to be done," came the shrill proclamation. And there she was, Karen, standing tall with her arms crossed, a smug grin spread across her face like she had just won a prize. The neighborhood's self-appointed queen, the woman who had terrorized residents over minor infractions, had now escalated to something far beyond the usual HOA nonsense. The wreckage was unmistakable. Helicopter. A real, fully operational aircraft, now reduced to twisted metal and shattered glass. The rotor blades were bent at unnatural angles, and a thick cloud of dust clung to the air, making it hard to breathe. People stared in disbelief, some with their mouths agape, others whispering in hushed tones, trying to piece together how in the world this had happened. But Karen, she stood there like she had just won a war, like she had single-handedly saved the neighborhood from some impending doom. "That thing was a violation," she screeched, pointing an accusatory finger toward the wreckage. "It was illegal, dangerous, and a complete eyesore. I had no choice." Her voice carried the kind of false confidence only a person completely detached from reality could muster. She was basking in her moment of supposed heroism, expecting applause, gratitude, maybe even a trophy for her bravery. But instead she was met with silence. Not the kind of silence that comes with admiration, but the kind that comes when people are too stunned to process what they've just witnessed. It was the eerie, stomach-churning quiet that signals the realization that something truly terrible has just happened. Karen, of course, didn't stop there. No, she had to keep justifying herself, as if she somehow believed she had the legal authority to take such extreme action. "You people don't understand. That thing has been sitting here for days. Right in plain sight. It's against every rule in the HOA handbook. It could have crashed into a house. It could have set a bad precedent. What if more people started parking helicopters here, huh? What then? This is a residential neighborhood, not a landing strip. I took action because no one else would." Her voice was growing more erratic, her face flushed with the thrill of what she thought was righteous justice. But as the dust settled and reality started sinking in, the weight of what she had done became undeniable. This wasn't just about some minor HOA violation. This was destruction of private property, of a helicopter. And as murmurs spread among the crowd, one question kept surfacing over and over again. Who even owns that thing? It was a mystery that hung in the air like the last embers of a dying fire. The wreckage, while mangled, still bore markings, official-looking insignia that hinted at something far beyond just an extravagant private owner. "It looks like it belongs to the government," someone whispered. Another person gasped, their eyes widening as they turned to their neighbor. "You don't think? No, it can't be." And then, like a domino effect, realization hit. People started putting the pieces together. The helicopter had been parked there temporarily, but not without reason. It had been seen landing near one of the largest homes in the neighborhood, a property belonging to none other than an official with direct ties to the state governor. The shift in the crowd's energy was immediate. What was once confusion turned into palpable fear. This wasn't just a wealthy homeowner's personal aircraft. This was property tied to the highest levels of state government. And Karen, she had just destroyed it. Karen's smug expression wavered as she started noticing the change in everyone's demeanor. People weren't cheering. They weren't thanking her for her heroic act. They were whispering, exchanging glances, stepping back from her as if she were radioactive. Wait, she stammered, suddenly unsure. It's not like, it doesn't matter who it belongs to. The rules are rules, our bylaws state. But her voice trailed off as a single unmistakable sound cut through the murmurs. Sirens. Loud, wailing sirens growing closer and closer. The kind that sent a chill down your spine because you knew something serious was about to go down. Karen's confidence cracked, just slightly. Just enough for her bravado to slip. Oh, come on, she scoffed, forcing out a laugh that sounded more like a nervous hiccup. They can't possibly be coming for me. But as the first police car screeched to a halt at the edge of the scene, followed by another, and then another, her face drained of color. Officers poured out, their faces stern, their eyes scanning the damage before settling on the one person who looked the guiltiest of them all. Karen took an involuntary step back. Okay, hold on, let's be rational here, she tried again, her voice pitching higher, the weight of the situation finally sinking in. But it was too late. The law had arrived, and the woman who had spent years making everyone else's lives miserable was about to get a taste of her own medicine. The silence that followed the arrival of law enforcement was deafening. The flashing lights reflected off the shattered glass and twisted metal of the ruined helicopter, painting the suburban street in a chaotic dance of red and blue. Neighbors stood frozen on their porches and sidewalks, wide-eyed and whispering among themselves. It wasn't every day that a swarm of police officers descended upon their quiet cul-de-sac, let alone over the wreckage of a state government helicopter. Karen, once the queen of the HOA, the self-proclaimed enforcer of the rules, now stood at the center of it all, looking more like a deer caught in the headlights than the bold hero she had styled herself to be just moments earlier. Her arms, once defiantly crossed, now hung awkwardly at her sides, and the confident sneer she'd worn had morphed into a tight, nervous grimace. You could almost hear the gears turning in her head as she tried to piece together an excuse, a justification, anything to explain away what she had done. Officers, she started, her voice cracking. This is just a big misunderstanding. I was only enforcing the HOA rules. This helicopter was an unapproved vehicle parked in our neighborhood. A violation of the bylaws. She clutched her clipboard, her ever-present symbol of power, like a lifeline, raising it as if the flimsy stack of papers might shield her from the consequences. But the officers didn't flinch. One officer, a tall man with a steely gaze, stepped forward. His voice was calm but firm, the kind of authority that didn't need to shout to be heard. "Ma'am, please step away from the wreckage." His words were simple, but they sliced through Karen's excuses like a knife. She blinked, her mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. But you don't understand. This is a violation of Article 14, Section B of the HOA Guidelines," she sputtered, as if quoting rules about lawn heights and fence colors could somehow justify destroying a government-owned aircraft. The officer didn't budge. "Ma'am," he repeated, his tone like granite, "this is no longer about HO rules. This is a criminal matter now." And just like that, the weight of the situation came crashing down on Karen's shoulders. You could see the shift in her expression, the dawning horror as she realized that this wasn't going to be another situation where she could strong-arm a neighbor into compliance with a warning letter or a fine. No, this time, the stakes were higher than she'd ever imagined. And for once, she wasn't the one calling the shots. As Karen stammered, trying to backtrack her way out of the mess she had created, the crowd's whispers grew louder. Neighbors who had once cowered under her iron rule now exchanged glances, some stunned, others satisfied. Because for years, they had watched Karen weaponize the HOA, using it as her personal tool of control. She had fined people for the most minor offenses: a flower pot in the wrong shade of beige, a slightly overgrown hedge, a child's chalk drawing on a sidewalk. She'd handed out citations like they were party favors, patrolling the neighborhood with her clipboard and smug sense of superiority. She had harassed elderly residents over minor infractions and shamed young families for anything that didn't align with her vision of a perfect community. But today Today, the neighborhood saw something they never thought they would. Karen standing there, powerless, facing the consequences of her own overreach. And for many of them, it was like witnessing karma in its purest form. Then came the moment that no one would ever forget. As the lead officer spoke into his radio, confirming the helicopter's ownership and assessing the damage, a sleek black car pulled up to the scene. The kind of car that didn't belong to a nosy neighbor or an out-of-town relative. No, this was official. A man stepped out, tall, sharply dressed, and exuding an air of authority that even Karen couldn't ignore. His face was stern, his gaze sweeping over the wreckage before landing squarely on Karen. The crowd murmured, some recognizing him instantly, the state governor's chief of security. The helicopter wasn't just some personal toy. It was government property, used for official state business. The gravity of what Karen had done became painfully clear in that moment. She hadn't just destroyed a neighbor's property. She had interfered with state operations. And now, she was standing face to face with the people who had the power to hold her accountable far beyond the limits of the HOA's rulebook. Karen's voice, once so sharp and domineering, now wobbled with panic. I didn't know. She stammered, her face pale as the officer explained the severity of the situation. I thought it was just some rich guy showing off. How was I supposed to know it belonged to the state? The excuses poured out like a broken faucet, desperate, illogical, and growing more incoherent by the second. But it didn't matter. The damage was done. And now, Karen was trapped in a web of her own making. The same overzealousness that she had used to punish others for trivial infractions had now turned against her in the most spectacular way. She had crossed a line, not just of common sense but of the law, and there was no getting out of it this time. Finally, the moment the entire neighborhood had unknowingly been waiting for arrived. As the officer calmly informed Karen that she was being taken in for questioning, potentially facing charges for destruction of government property, obstruction of state operations, and more, the handcuffs came out. Karen's face twisted into a mix of shock and indignation. Wait, you can't do this. I'm the head of the HO. I was just enforcing the rules, she shrieked, her voice cracking under the weight of the moment. But the officer didn't flinch. With practiced efficiency, he placed the cuffs around Karen's wrists, the metallic click echoing like a final punctuation mark to her reign of terror. The neighborhood watched in stunned silence. A few gasps, some awkward shuffles, but beneath the surface, there was a sense of poetic justice. Karen, the self-proclaimed enforcer of rules, was now facing consequences of a magnitude she had never anticipated. And as she was escorted toward the police car, still sputtering excuses about HOA guidelines and community standards, the reality hit her. She was no longer the one in control. As Karen was escorted to the police car, the air in the neighborhood felt electric, a strange blend of disbelief, satisfaction, and uneasy silence. But the moment the car door slammed shut, it was like a dam broke. Neighbors who had spent years tiptoeing around Karen's wrath now exchanged glances, some shaking their heads, others whispering under their breath. Yet one voice rose above the murmurs. Mrs. Jenkins, a sweet, soft-spoken widow who had lived in the neighborhood longer than Karen herself. "It's about time," she said softly, her words simple but carrying a weight that everyone felt. Mrs. Jenkins had been one of Karen's prime targets. Fined for the height of her garden fence, threatened for leaving her trash bin out an hour too long, and berated for hosting a small birthday party for her granddaughter without proper HOA approval. The injustice had simmered quietly for years, but now, as Karen sat in the back of a police cruiser, the scales seemed to finally tip. The community wasn't just witnessing Karen's downfall. They were feeling the ripple of long-awaited justice. It wasn't about revenge. It was about accountability. And in that moment, it became clear that Karen's reign of petty tyranny hadn't just bruised egos. It had wounded a community. But the drama wasn't over yet. Moments after Karen was driven away, another car, sleek and official-looking, rolled into the neighborhood. Out stepped the state governor's representative, a composed yet stern woman in a tailored suit, clipboard in hand. She surveyed the scene, her gaze landing on the mangled helicopter, the stunned neighbors, and the remnants of Karen's so-called HOA authority. It wasn't just about the wreckage. It was about the bigger picture. The representative wasted no time addressing the crowd. Her voice steady but firm. "This incident will be fully investigated," she announced, sending a wave of both relief and tension through the crowd. The neighbors weren't just watching a spectacle. They were now part of an unfolding legal storm. "The state does not take interference with government property lightly," she continued, "and we will ensure that those responsible are held accountable." The words hung heavy in the air, not just for Karen but for the entire HOA board, who had stood by and enabled her unchecked authority for far too long. There was an unspoken question in everyone's mind. How much of Karen's tyranny had been supported, or at the very least ignored, by the board? And then came the bombshell, the moment that would shift the neighborhood's future forever. The governor's representative, with a glance at the board members who had gathered silently at the edge of the scene, made a startling announcement. "We will also be conducting a full review of the HOA's practices to determine if any other violations have occurred under Mrs. Karen's leadership." The crowd rippled with surprise. It wasn't just Karen on the chopping block now. The entire foundation of her rule was being questioned. For years, Karen had operated under the illusion of untouchable authority, waving her rulebook like a sword. But now that same rulebook was being scrutinized. Every fine, every citation, every so-called bylaw enforcement, all of it was under the microscope. The board members, who had once stood shoulder to shoulder with Karen, suddenly looked pale, their alliance with her now a liability rather than a shield. One of them, Mr. Halverson, a man known for nodding along to Karen's every word, stammered, "We were just following the rules." Karen said it was all by the book. But the excuse fell flat. The community wasn't buying it. The web of complicity was unraveling, and the board's silence over the years was beginning to look a lot like guilt. In the days that followed, the neighborhood transformed, not just physically but emotionally. Karen's absence was like a weight lifted off the community's shoulders, but the scars of her reign remained. The review of the HOA's practices uncovered years of unlawful citations, excessive fines, and unethical practices, all orchestrated by Karen with the board's silent approval. Neighbors shared their stories. Mrs. Jenkins spoke of the time Karen threatened her with legal action over a misplaced garden gnome. A young couple revealed how they were almost forced to move because of Karen's relentless harassment over their non-compliant holiday decorations. And an elderly veteran broke down recounting how Karen fined him for flying an unapproved American flag. It wasn't just about spike strips or helicopters. It was about control, about fear, about a community ruled by one woman's thirst for power. The governor's team worked swiftly, dismantling the old HOA structure and implementing strict oversight to prevent future abuse. And for the first time in years, the community had a voice, not dictated by Karen's clipboard but by collective choice. And then there was Karen's fate, the final twist that sealed the story in the neighborhood's history forever. The charges against her were severe: destruction of government property, obstruction of state operations, and abuse of power. But what shocked everyone wasn't just the criminal charges. It was the civil lawsuits. Neighbors, emboldened by the state's intervention, banded together and filed a class action suit against Karen and the HOA board, seeking compensation for years of harassment and emotional distress. Karen, who once wielded the HOA as her personal weapon, now found herself on the receiving end of legal action. And the irony wasn't lost on anyone. Court appearances replaced HOA meetings, and the same neighbors Karen had once fined for unauthorized mailbox colors now stood united, demanding justice. The court ruled in favor of the community, awarding damages to those affected and permanently banning Karen from any future HOA leadership roles. She wasn't just removed from power. She was publicly held accountable, her name forever tied to the downfall of a broken system. But the most powerful moment came at the very end, the true lesson buried beneath all the drama. With Karen gone and the HOA restructured, the neighborhood slowly healed. People who had once avoided each other out of fear of Karen's wrath now gathered for block parties and community events. Mrs. Jenkins' garden bloomed freely without the threat of a fine, Children played in driveways without Karen's clipboard looming over them, and the American flag waved proudly from the veteran's porch, untouchable and unchallenged. It wasn't just a victory over Karen. It was a reclamation of community. The neighbors learned that true leadership doesn't come from fear and control. It comes from unity, compassion, and collective strength. Karen's downfall wasn't just about justice. It was a wake-up call. The community realized that staying silent in the face of injustice only empowers the tyrant. And so, they vowed never to let history repeat itself. Their neighborhood was no longer ruled by a clipboard. It was led by the heart of its people.